Good afternoon, and welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center. My name is Will Pomerantz. I'm Deputy Director here at the Kennan Institute. A few administrative matters to take care of before we get started. Please, everyone turn off their cell phones and electronic devices as they interfere with our sound system. We are coming to the end of our calendar. Indeed, we only have one more speaker before we begin our summer hiatus. Next Monday, June 18th, we'll have Catherine Graber, another Title VIII Fellow, talking here on local media and ethnic politics in 21st century Russia. And then we will reconvene in the fall on Monday, September 24th for a noon discussion where Mark Katz, a professor of government at George Mason University and former Title VIII Fellow, will be talking about Russian-Iranian relations, implications for U.S. policy. Well, today we're very fortunate to have two Title VIII scholars in residence here to talk to you. We're going to be hearing from Danielle Lussier and Jody Laporte on the failure of democracy in post-Soviet Eurasia. I'll just give some brief bios beforehand, and then we'll get started. Professor Lussier is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at Grinnell College, where she teaches Russian politics, Islamic politics, and politics of regime change. She previously worked at Harvard's Kennedy School, as well as the East-West Institute in New York. She received her undergraduate education at Wesleyan University and her graduate degree from the University of California at Berkeley. Danielle will be followed by Jody Laporte, who will be joining the Department of Political Science at Wittenberg University as an assistant professor in August. As I mentioned, she's also a Title VIII supported research scholar here at the Kennan Institute. She received her undergraduate education at Yale University and her graduate degree as well from the University of California at Berkeley. So without further ado, I think we're going to hand the floor over to Danielle, and then Jody, and then we'll open the floor for questions. So, Danielle.
Thank you, Will. And by way of starting, I also wanted to thank the Kennan Institute for hosting the seminar today and providing Jody and me with the opportunity to share our research with you. So I'm going to talk specifically about the case of Russia. Our overall seminar is the failure of democracy in post-communist Eurasia, but my remarks are going to be focused specifically on Russia. Since the 1970s, more than 60 countries, almost one-third of the countries in the world today, have made transitions to democracy. At the turn of the most recent century, 60% of the world's countries were democratic. Yet not all countries that undergo democratic transition and hold fair and free elections continue to survive as democracies. There are numerous examples of countries that successfully complete a transition to a democracy and subsequently regress back toward a form of authoritarian rule. According to the organization Freedom House, which tracks global trends in democracy, as of 2011, global freedom had declined for 6 consecutive years. This is the longest continuous period of setbacks since the annual surveys were initiated in 1972. Many former communist countries fit into this picture. They constructed democratic institutions, held initial elections that were largely fair and free, and then reverted back to authoritarianism, sometimes slowly and other times more quickly. This phenomenon motivated the research for the book manuscript that I'm working on here at the Kennan Institute, which asks the question, why did democracy fail to survive in Russia? Russia is an important country for us to ask this question about, not only because of its position in global politics, but also for its relevance to social scientists trying to understand conditions under which countries transition to democracies and survive as democracies. Russia is an outlier in the context of prevailing democratization theories. Its level of wealth, education, and history of independent statehood, communism notwithstanding, suggests it should be a more politically open polity than it is today. So today I'm going to talk to you about 3 things in particular. First, I'm going to define democracy and present measures for evaluating the level of democracy in Russia. I'm then going to provide a brief summary of my argument for why democracy has failed in Russia. And then I'm going to discuss the implications of the recent protest activity observed in Russia for the future of Russian authoritarianism. So we'll start with this definition. Democracy is defined here as the procedures that ensure competition for leadership positions through fair, free, and frequent elections and the assurance of open debate about candidates and policies through freedoms of speech, media, and association. Many of the regimes of the former Soviet Union have adopted several of the political institutions required for modern large-scale democracy, but fail to uphold the civil liberties that give meaning to these political institutions and prevent their manipulation by political elites. So how do we go about measuring democracy? There are many different indices that provide scores for different countries in the world based on these criteria that I've laid out for what we would consider to be the procedural minimum for democracy. One organization is Freedom House, which provides annual scores on two dimensions, political rights and civil liberties, that can be averaged together for what we call the composite freedom score. These range from a level of 1, which is equal to a completely open polity, to a low of 7, which is considered to be a completely closed polity. Now, this image here is a graph of Russia's Freedom House scores from the period of 1989 through 2011. And to give you some context to explain this graph, Russia falls into roughly 3 stages. You had political liberalization beginning in the late Soviet period, in 1989, with the introduction of competitive elections and freedoms of speech, movement, and association. This was followed by a period of relative political openness in the mid-1990s, and then starting in 1998, Russia began a steady decline towards authoritarianism. Specific examples of authoritarian backsliding that we witnessed in Russia include adopting laws that have obstructed the development of opposition political parties, raising the threshold for entrance into the legislature to benefit the party in power, canceling gubernatorial elections, and introducing regulations that have severely curtailed the freedom of press and freedom of association. Now, the current level of political openness, or if you might want to think of it level of, or lack of political openness that this graph shows you, we see that the current level is similar to what you saw in Russia in the late Soviet period. But more importantly, it's stable. This is a level of political freedom that we've seen in Russia basically since Putin began his second term in 2004. Now, there are several common explanations for the failure of democracy in Russia. 2 of the most common fall into what I would call sort of an institutional explanation, and 2 center themselves more on the level of society or the level of culture. So first I'll talk about these 2 institutional explanations. One is this standard resource curse argument, that economic reliance on hydrocarbons has insulated political elites from popular pressures. A second institutional argument focuses on the 1993 constitution that Russia adopted, and this is a constitution that puts an enormous amount of power in the executive. We call it a super-presidentialist constitution. And consequently, the horizontal accountability of different branches of government was significantly reduced, making it very easy for an individual who wanted to hold a lot of power in the presidency to force that power into his hands. 2 other common explanations, as I mentioned, are located more at the societal level. One is this standard legacy argument, that Russia's long history of authoritarian rule under the Russian Empire and then under communism has instilled in the Russian people a preference for a strong hand in government, or at the very least, a lack of interest in politics. They're willing to tolerate a more authoritarian leader. A second societal level explanation focuses on something more specific, and this is a backlash to the economic liberalization reforms that were introduced in Russia in the early 1990s, which people argue discredited the concept of democracy among Russians. Now, all of these explanations are plausible, but they all assume that certain attitudes and behaviors are present among Russian citizens. In all cases, it's assumed that these factors influence individuals in such a way that mass support for democratic institutions and practices remains low. These accounts emphasize the pervasive effects of the structure of the economy, institutional design, and mass preferences as factors that reshape the incentives that political elites are faced with, making it easier for them to roll back democratic reforms with impunity. If we pare prevailing explanations down to their core, it becomes very clear that they're all connected by mass political participation. And the dynamic interplay between the amount of democracy that elites supply and the amount of democracy that the mass public demands, the elites have had the upper hand in post-Soviet Russia. So I argue that patterns in non-voting political participation after initial democratic elections have taken place shape whether democracy survives over time or not. So how does this work? Something that we often forget about is that the process of democratization inherently entails a broadening of political opportunities for participation on behalf of citizens. This varies from country to country, but at a minimum, 2 arenas for activism are open that would have previously been closed. The first is the building and support of opposition parties that would have been repressed under an authoritarian regime. And the second is peaceful protest and criticism of the existing regime that, again, had these activities been undertaken under authoritarianism, the individuals involved would have been repressed. Participation in these types of activities that constrain elites need to increase after initial elections in order to ensure that incumbents adhere to the letter and the spirit of democratic institutions rather than manipulating them for short-term policy ends. While most research on political participation in democratizing regimes focuses on voting as the most common and foundational of political acts, my research analyzes non-voting political participation. And what I find is that Russians failed to engage in the non-voting participatory acts that constrain elites, making it possible for political elites to dismantle democratic institutions with impunity. So I disaggregate political participation into 2 categories: elite enabling and elite constraining activities. So what's the difference? Elite constraining activities are those that impede political elites from abusing democratic norms and institutions between elections. So examples of elite constraining participation include building and supporting opposition parties, supporting campaigns for opposition candidates, and engaging in acts of contentious politics. The expansion of opportunities for political participation after democratic transition facilitates occasions for elite constraining political participation. So for example, when citizens protest a decision, this draws public attention to it. It forces a political leader to defend his position and also causes him to rethink taking similar steps in the future, as it may hurt his chances for re-election. In these instances, a political leader must react to a situation on the terms set by the citizens who are participating. Elite enabling participation, in contrast, is participation that shores up the power of existing political elites and can be used by them to maintain political authority. So examples of elite enabling political participation include contacting public officials to receive some sort of constituent service or supporting hegemonic parties. So for example, if a citizen engages with a local assembly member to have a pothole fixed, it's possible for that assembly member to fix the pothole without actually adhering to any democratic institutions or norms. In this case, the citizen continues to support the particular assembly person because he or she fixed the pothole, but that support is not at all contingent on delivering democracy. Moreover, it remains a private exchange. No one's talking about in the public how well this assembly person fixes the pothole. What happens is it ends up being a relationship that's in the private, between a private citizen and a political leader. In these instances, it's possible for political leaders to gain public support, maintain re-election opportunities without actually increasing the level of democracy that you see in the political society. So I find that elite constraining participation needs to expand after a transition for democracy to survive. Otherwise, elites have an interest in manipulating new democratic institutions to benefit their own short-term ends, and this is what we saw happening in Russia. So just to give you a brief summary of the data that I used to reach this conclusion, I used a variety of different types of data. I conducted 50 open-ended interviews with citizens in using a quota sample of citizens in 2 different Russian cities. I also interviewed about 70 representatives of political parties and mass movements in Russia, and I analyzed 7 nationally representative public opinion surveys. And my data are through 2008, so they do not necessarily reflect the most current developments. The chart that I have on this slide here represents data gathered from several public opinion surveys aimed at looking at participation indicators over time. And what I've done is I've divided them up into 3 categories: contacting public officials, engaging in political party and campaign work, and contentious politics. And what you see here is that there's a decline in all 3 forms of activity over time. The highest level of engagement, even through 2003, remains contacting public officials. So my research, both based on these data that you see before you and other data that I have in my book manuscript, points to three important trends in Russia. One is that non-voting political participation, as you can see here, peaked in the late Soviet period and then has declined subsequently over the past 20 years. With the exception of contacting public officials, most non-voting political participation in Russia is episodic. So with the exception of a handful of committed activists, most Russians have participated in one campaign, engaged in one protest. They don't tend to repeat that activity. The only form of activity they repeat is contacting public officials. And the third finding is that young people are the least engaged in political participation as of 2008. But most importantly, this decline that I noticed precedes the decline in the level of political openness in Russia. So notice that the big drop that you see here is between 1990 and 1995. That was the period when you had the most political openness in Russia. The authoritarian decline that I showed you earlier didn't happen until 1998. So this drop-off in political participation is not simply a consequence of the regime tightening up controls that make it harder for people to participate. So how does this work? Let me give you an example of this interplay that I am talking about. And the example I'm going to give you has to do with the cancellation of gubernatorial elections in 2004. So in 2004, President Putin canceled elections for governors. And this decision was passively accepted by the population, even though, as the poll I have in this slide shows, 48% of the population disagreed with it. In fact, public opinion has consistently showed ever since then that Russians support direct election for governors. But there were no public protests against this decision, and it received no major criticism by the population. So in my interviews with Russian citizens, I asked respondents about governors' elections first in theoretical terms, and I asked them if, in their opinion, regional executives and representatives should be elected by the people or appointed. Of the 36 interviews in which this was discussed, 26 respondents favored election to 4 who favored appointment. When I asked them specifically about Putin's repeal, they generally responded in one of two ways. First, they would either say, well, you know what, it's okay if the president appoints the governor because he knows better who would be a good governor. And this attitude is exemplified by the quotes that I put up on this slide here. The other response that I heard was, well, you know, nothing really changed for us because the governor stayed the same, at which people are responding to the fact that in many instances, Putin reappointed governors who had been popularly elected during a period of elections. Well, of course, the point that I'm trying to make here is that this is a very blatant anti-democratic action, which went against the democratic principles that most Russians held, but was not met with any meaningful objection by the public. So let's talk now about this new protest movement. For those of you who've been following Russian politics closely for the past 6 months, the picture of non-participation that I've been describing will seem really strange to you. It's inconsistent with what we've been seeing. So I want to give a little bit of context about what I consider to be this new protest movement. So allegations of major fraud during the December 4th, 2011 State Duma elections generated a renewed interest in street protest. On December 10th, 2011, more than 25,000 individuals demonstrated on the streets of Moscow to protest allegations of fraud. Protests were held in more than 60 cities across the Russian Federation. The Moscow protest was the largest one witnessed in Russia in 20 years. Similarly, large protests were held again on December 24th, with an estimated turnout of 120,000 people in Moscow. Since then, protest action has continued, though on a smaller scale, across the country. Protest activities have taken on a variety of forms, both sanctioned and unsanctioned. Large-scale protests were held again in advance of Putin's inauguration in May. So how's the regime responded to this? As far as I can tell, they've responded in two ways. One is they've responded with a limited amount of liberalization, and the second way they've responded is with heightened coercion. So I'll talk briefly about this limited liberalization. The December 10th protest in Moscow, which had crowd estimates of between 25 and 100,000 people, was concluded without a single arrest. This coming from a regime that had made arrests for actions like blocking a sidewalk, for example, just days before, at protests that were significantly smaller in size. Similarly, the protest that took place today in Moscow in which the turnout was somewhere between 18,000 and 100,000, took part without a single arrest. Second, the initial December protests were shown on state television, and coverage was generally viewed as objective. Boris Nemtsov, one of the opposition leaders, was shown on Russian public television for the first time in almost a decade. We also saw somewhat cleaner, or at least less obvious fraud in the presidential elections in March. And lastly, we've seen the reintroduction of extremely limited and restricted gubernatorial elections. So these are some of these examples of limited liberalization. But what about the heightened coercion? So the street-level response to protest activity has become much more intense, particularly in the past month. The May 5th protest in Moscow devolved into violence, which involved the use of tear gas and the arrest of more than 450 demonstrators. There are reports of protesters throwing rocks at the riot police and of the police using excessive force. We've also seen a street-level response of holding pro-regime rallies, support rallies for Putin, simultaneously at the same time that anti-system rallies are being held. According to a May 31st Moscow News article, there have been many cases coming to light of public sector employees being forced to take part in these pro-Putin rallies or facing termination from their employment. Last week, as I'm sure many of you are aware, Putin signed into law a bill that dramatically increased fines for participating in unsanctioned rallies. The maximum fine was increased from 5,000 rubles, or about $150, to 300,000 rubles, or about $9,000. Just to give you a sense of that, the average annual salary for most Russians is $8,500, so it's an enormous fine. The fine for organizing an unsanctioned rally was raised to 1 million rubles, or more than $30,000 for the organizers. Yesterday, the homes of 10 opposition activists were searched. The police confiscated computers and more than 1 million euros in cash. Several activists were summoned for interrogation this morning, which prevented them from participating in the protest activity today, which commemorates Russia Day, which is the anniversary of Russia's declaration of sovereignty from the Soviet Union. These activities raise concern about possible criminal allegations being raised against protesters. So there's evidence that this increase in elite constraining activity that we've seen in the past 6 months in Russia is having an effect on the way existing elites respond. We're getting evidence of some limited liberalization, some evidence of heightened coercion, particularly in the past month. So how has the opposition been responding to this? There are a few different ways. First, as I mentioned, we're seeing an intensification of street protests. In particular, we see this development of Occupy encampments happening. Russian protesters are very smart. They know that if they gather in a public place and they don't shout any slogans and they don't carry any signs, it means that it's not an unsanctioned rally and they can't be arrested for it. So we're seeing a lot of really creative protest activity. At the same time, we're seeing some interesting opposition activity happening in the Duma. Namely, the Just Russia and Communist Party factions are actually starting to act like opposition. Last week, when the bill for raising fines for unsanctioned protests was under debate, they introduced more than 400 amendments to it with the goal of slowing down the process and forcing the Duma to have to go into late-night sessions to prevent the bill from being quickly adopted. We've also seen some increased organization among the opposition for participation in mayoral elections. So, for example, in Omsk, the local branches of Yabloko and the Communist Party have signed an agreement to coordinate their actions in the upcoming election. In Yaroslavl, an independent ran and won election on an anti-corruption platform. And lastly, in March, we saw that 200 independent candidates ran for district seats in Moscow districts, and more than 70 of them won. So what we're seeing here is that elite constraining activity in terms of contentious politics is on the rise, and we're seeing some movement in terms of increased opposition activity within conventional spheres as well. Well, to me, this raises the question of, is this elite constraint sustainable in Russia? And to be honest, I'm not very optimistic about it for 4 reasons. First, the non-systemic opposition, so the street protesters, and the existing opposition in the Duma, they're not unified. And more importantly, both sides have incentives to not unite. For protesters to get too close to existing parties in the Duma, they'll be perceived as compromising on their principles. For existing parties to get too close to the street protesters, they run the risk of running afoul of the Kremlin and not being allowed to continue their existence as well. Secondly, the protest movement's not unified. we see that it includes sort of your classical liberal Democrats. It also includes anarchists, nationalists, leftist populists. System destruction always casts a wider umbrella than system building. And the history of opposition in post-Soviet Russia has generally shown that these groups don't get along well. So there's not a lot of hope necessarily that they're going to be able to channel their energy to build sort of more conventional activities that are successful. Third, the system's not liberalized enough to make it possible for new parties to register. So for example, the Party of People's Freedom, which is the largest non-registered party among the protesters, they've been unable to gain registration. The newly introduced gubernatorial elections are so restrictive that they don't meet our basic criteria for fair and free elections. It's very difficult to get individuals nominated for them. And lastly is this issue of financing, which still hasn't been resolved. So Russian political parties have not developed an adequate system for party financing until big business feels as though it's safe for them to participate in making political donations without losing their livelihood, and there's no indication that they've been given that this is okay to do. Russian opposition is going to be starved out of having the funds to successfully wager campaigns. So just a couple of concluding thoughts. Russia's post-Soviet political trajectory has witnessed a decline in non-voting political participation and a decline in open politics. On the whole, Russians have historically shown themselves to be more interested in elite enabling activities than those that can successfully constrain elites. We've witnessed an increase in elite constraining activity in the past 6 months, which further illustrates the dynamic interaction between political elites and the mass public. The regimes responded to these activities with both a certain amount of liberalism, but also a certain amount of heightened coercion. And it remains to be seen which response will ultimately win out, and whether this protest energy can be mobilized effectively into conventional elite constraining activities such as building a competitive party system. Thank you, and I'm going to turn the floor over to Jody.
Thanks, Danielle, for a great presentation, and I'm sure we'll have a lot to talk about with our two presentations in tandem. Before I get started, I'd first like to thank the Kennan Institute, as well as the Woodrow Wilson Center and the Title VIII program for their generous support and for hosting me during my stay in DC. Okay. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the 15 countries that emerged were saddled with some pretty high expectations. As you might remember, back in 1991, a lot of people thought that post-Soviet Eurasia was going to be the next region to get swept up in the third wave of democratization, or as Ronald Reagan called it at the time, the worldwide democratic revolution. And as you may remember, the third wave of democratization started in Portugal in the mid-1970s, and over the course of the 1970s and the 1980s, spread to Latin America, parts of Africa, Asia, and other parts of the world where military dictatorships and other forms of authoritarian regimes collapsed and were replaced with democratic institutions and free and fair elections. And in 1989 in East Europe, and again in 1991 with the collapse of the Soviet Union, many observers predicted that the post-Soviet Eurasia was going to be the next region to get swept up in this wave of democratization that was spreading across the world. But 20 years later, only 3 post-Soviet countries have actually become democracies. The 3 Baltic countries of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania have held regular elections that are free of vote fraud and include universal suffrage with peaceful turnovers in power. But as you can see from this list, the other 12 countries that emerged from the Soviet Union do not. In 12 out of the 15 post-Soviet countries, elections are held, but there is too much vote fraud and electoral manipulation for these elections to be considered free or fair. To put it another way, 12 of the 15 countries have non-democratic regimes. Yet another way of looking at this, in order to further emphasize exactly how widespread non-democracy is across post-Soviet Eurasia, only 1% of the territory that was ruled by the Soviet Union, 1% now lives under, is now governed by a democratic regime. And of the Soviet population, today only 2% of the population lives under democracy. So all of this points to the fact that authoritarianism is a major political dynamic to be taken seriously across Eurasia. And with so many cases of non-democracy in the region, it's worth considering what these regimes have in common versus where they differ. In reality, not all authoritarian regimes work the same way. But this is a point that's been largely overlooked in recent decades because of our focus on democracy and democratization. Authoritarianism has been treated as a residual category by scholars as well as some policymakers, given the focus on democratization, and in turn, we've glossed over a lot of important differences among authoritarian regimes. In the past few years, scholars have begun to actually unpack authoritarianism and to explore some of these differences, and that's where my work fits in. My work joins this growing literature. And the book manuscript that I'm working on while I'm here examines one particular point of variation across non-democratic regimes, and that is the treatment of political opposition, and specifically how political opposition is treated between election periods across post-Soviet countries. Let me pause and talk for a minute about why I'm examining the treatment of political opposition, in contrast to all of the many ways that authoritarian regimes differ and that I could look at. There are 4 reasons why I think that the treatment of political opposition is actually quite important to consider. The first is conceptual. The treatment of political opposition actually has important implications for our understanding of political regimes. Among scholars, there's a widespread recognition that democracy extends beyond just elections. Democracy and what constitutes a democratic regime really entails more than just what happens on election day. But beyond that, it's actually very difficult to be systematic on the 364 other days of the year. We understand that the protection of civil liberties is quite important, but despite many attempts by Freedom House and other organizations, it's very difficult to be able to quantify or even qualitatively assess these differences. In addition to the conceptual reasons, there's also predictive reasons to study how opposition is treated across these regimes. The status, the role, and the treatment of political opposition affects a country's prospects for future political stability, especially the stability of the authoritarian regime versus predictions of authoritarian collapse. So I think that by studying this point, we can actually be more accurate in our predictions about what's going to happen across this region. Third, there are normative considerations. This point has important implications for the quality of life of citizens in these countries, including whether or not they can vote for opposition parties, whether or not they can join them, whether or not there can be meaningful contestation. And finally, there's policy relevance in this point as well. Many foreign policy efforts by Western governments are targeted towards developing political opposition, supporting the growth of opposition parties and whatnot. And as a result, it's important to understand, I believe, the context in which these political opposition groups work, the issues confronting them, and the various ways that some of the governments might be working to undermine such party development efforts. When observers talk about the treatment of political opposition, there's usually a focus on elections, as I mentioned. Are such elections free and fair or not? But what my research shows, and what I'm going to be discussing today, is that across post-Soviet Eurasia, the biggest difference, the most important variation when it comes to the treatment of political opposition, doesn't come during election periods, but rather there's great variation in how governments deal with political opposition in the periods between elections. I examine this issue in 3 country cases. First is the country of Georgia, and specifically in the time period under Edward Shevardnadze. And I look at the years between 1995 and 2003 in Georgia. Second case is Azerbaijan under Presidents Haidar and Ilham Aliyev, and that's the years I look at there between 1995 and 2010. And the third country that I look at is Kazakhstan under President Nursultan Nazarbayev, and again between 1995 and 2010. And during the Q&A, I'm happy to take questions about why I chose those years and why they differ slightly. What these cases have in common is 2 things. First, they share similar electoral practices. These governments administer, or actually, to be more specific, manipulate elections in very similar ways across the 3 countries. The second thing they hold in common is their treatment of political opposition during election campaigns, which is to say, in these three countries, during election campaigns, between the start of campaigning of elections and the actual election day, the way that opposition is handled by the government is quite similar across elections and across these cases. So that's what these countries have in common, elections, and the way they're held. Where they differ, however, is in what the government does between elections and how the government treats political opposition between election periods. Before we go on, I just want to define political opposition as I see it. I define political opposition as groups that challenge, contest, or criticize government policies, government leaders, or the legitimacy of the regime overall. And in practice in post-Soviet Eurasia, this includes three basic groups, or three basic types of groups. The first is opposition political parties. In addition, some NGOs can also be considered to be political opposition, especially human rights NGOs and other non-governmental organizations that engage in political acts. And finally, independent and opposition media, which includes both newspapers as well as any broadcast media that is not associated with the government. Okay, so let's go through these points. The similarities across these three cases. First, they share similar administration of elections. None of these countries have had an election that was deemed to meet international standards for free and fair democratic elections during the period that I examine, which is to say that Western observers have not declared any of these elections to be free and fair. But their commonality extends beyond that. In fact, not only do they not hold free and fair elections, but the ways that they manipulate these elections are quite similar. For one, the first point concerns the Central Election Committee in each country. In each case, the Central Election Committee during election periods is dominated by pro-government officials or officials under the influence or affiliated with the government, president, or ruling party. In each country, the appointment of the election commissions based on a combination of nomination or approval from the president as well as parliament in order to provide checks and balances, in order to provide ostensibly a neutral election committee. However, this is problematic in practice, as in most cases the parliament as well as president are a member of the same team, the same ruling party. And so as a result, we get election commissions dominated by pro-government officials. And remember, of course, that the election commissions are the highest body administering the elections and the body that undertakes most of the major decisions about how the election will proceed. Furthermore, these election commissions, in all cases, operate in a largely untransparent manner. This is something that comes up in international observation reports over and over again. Through various means, the transparency of the election commission's decisions have been obscured, and so it's really unclear exactly what's going on behind the scenes. The second commonality in the election administration concerns the abuse of state resources, specifically to mobilize support for the government or the ruling party. In these elections across the cases, there's a blurring of lines between state affairs and the incumbents' campaigns. Often public offices, state offices, are used as also party headquarters or campaign headquarters, campaigning of local officials on behalf of the ruling party. And one of the most common commonalities has to do with the public sector employees. Teachers, doctors, school children, university students are often mobilized to attend ruling party rallies and required to vote for the incumbent. We also see an abuse of state resources across these cases as concerns state media, where state media, despite legal restrictions requiring them to give a certain amount of time to opposition groups, they largely fulfill those legal restrictions and then go on to spend most of the rest of the time airing pro-government campaign commercials and advertisements and other forms of campaigning. And finally, as concerns the administration of elections, these three countries share similar practices as concerns vote fraud across these elections. So across the cases, across the elections, both parliamentary as well as presidential, there are reports of ballot box stuffing, voter intimidation, and election officials that are observed falsifying or forging protocols and voting ballots. And overall, we can say that there are widespread irregularities reported across the years in vote tabulation for each of the 3 countries. So they administer elections, or shall we say, they manipulate elections in largely similar ways. In addition, the other similarity across these 3 cases is in the treatment of opposition during election campaigns. So besides just the administrative aspects of things, opposition candidates are prevented from registering. They're granted only limited space to campaign. So they are often technically permitted to hold campaign rallies, but only within strict limits of time and space. And candidates that try to campaign on behalf of the opposition are often subject to occasional harassment, intimidation, and occasionally arrest during their campaigning. At the same time, independent media during election campaigns across these countries usually operates virtually unfettered. That is to say, there are few attacks on independent media during election campaigns. That's what these 3 countries hold in common. Where they differ as concerns political opposition, though, is between elections. I'd like to spend a little time parsing out the differences and the variation in what happens between elections across these 3 countries. So just to give you the end of the story first, I described the repressive strategy in each country as such. In Georgia, under Shevardnadze, repression was intermittent. In Azerbaijan, repression has been responsive, and in Kazakhstan, I describe repression as unconditional. I'm going to go through each of these in turn and how I came to that conclusion. But for those of you who like to keep things simple, you can also think of these as low, medium, and high. Okay, so there's variation across each of these 3 columns, and let me just run through these quickly. The first thing I consider is the target of government attacks. In Georgia, political opposition that's targeted for repression appeared to be almost targeted at random. A few opposition leaders or groups were targeted, suffered from retaliation, but most didn't. Most got off without any problems. And you can see no direct cause and effect in Shevardnadze's Georgia between what you did or who you were and whether you actually suffered from repression. One human rights report described the government's strategy as, quote, to ignore specific criticism. In the case of media, there were instances of media representatives being harassed or attacked, but no persistent concerted persecution campaign against them took place. In Azerbaijan, in contrast, the targeting is contingent. Repression happens as a direct consequence of certain opposition activities and topics. There are certain topics that are considered to be not allowed. That is to say, that actually do provoke a reaction from the government. So groups that engage or through either public statements or through their activities, topics such as democracy and democratization in Azerbaijan, human rights, or criticism of government officials, often are likely to see a reaction from the government. And certain topics have become, in Azerbaijan we actually see change over time, that more topics have been added to this verboten list. And in that case, criticism of the president has been considered to be less okay today than it used to be. And public rallies is one activity that used to be more widely sanctioned than it is now. In Kazakhstan, all opposition is the target. It's just, if you're opposition, you are likely to be a victim of repression. The second column concerns the dominant tactic, which is to say, what does the government actually do? In Georgia, I describe the tactic as critical, which is to say that in Georgia, under Shevardnadze, the government, in return, engaged in public and private criticism. According to journalists and NGOs, security officials on occasion attempted to intimidate the press through public comments, private admonitions, and quite rarely violence. In Azerbaijan, the dominant tactic has been judicial, which is to say criminal prosecution and civil lawsuits, which often result in large fines and time spent in prison. These include defamation suits, high court fines for libel convictions, and other measures that were taken through the courts. These tactics have also gotten more violent, more serious over time. So harassment and threats have escalated into some cases of physical violence in Azerbaijan as well. And in Kazakhstan, I would describe the dominant tactic of the government as violence. though court cases are common as well. And during the Q&A, I can go through some cases, some examples of this. Finally, I consider government intent, which is to say, as far as we can ascertain and infer, what is a government trying to achieve by pursuing these strategies? In Georgia, Shevardnadze's government generally seemed to want to harass the opposition, not to eradicate it, just to make their life a little bit more difficult. In Azerbaijan, in contrast, repression seems to be designed to discourage the opposition from engaging in certain activities or for bringing up certain topics, specifically the topics that I listed a few minutes ago. And in Kazakhstan, repression seems designed to eradicate the opposition, to actually prevent opposition from existing at all. So very quickly, why do we see these differences? This is a different part of my project that I will continue to be working on, but I basically would offer, two hypotheses for why we see this variation in government strategies between elections. One has to do with the nature of the opposition in each country, and specifically whether the opposition groups are pre-existing or emerging. All three of these governments face the problems of dealing with a new generation of opposition leaders, that is to say, opposition groups that have emerged while Shevardnadze, Aliyev, and Nazarbayev were in power. But Georgia and Azerbaijan, or shall we say Shevardnadze and Aliyev, have also faced the problem of pre-existing opposition. Opposition that existed prior to when they took power. And this has to do with the political history and the legacy of the Glasnost and early years of independence in both countries. Those are two different problems and may require two different strategies on the part of the government. The second hypothesis that I would offer is the patterns of corruption that predominate in each country. These rulers can be described as wealth-seeking, which is to say they have all accumulated vast private wealth that is gained through the illegal use of their public office to acquire private gain. But we see variation in where this illegal wealth comes from. For example, in Shevardnadze's Georgia, the predominant form of source of wealth was society itself, from which the government extracted bribes. In contrast, in Kazakhstan today, the primary source of wealth is believed to be embezzlement from state oil resources and other natural resources. And this can lead to very different incentives for the government in the way that they treat both political opposition as well as society in general. So just to conclude, by way of summary, there are 2 points of variation in the treatment of political opposition across post-Soviet non-democracies, especially in Central Asia and the Caucasus. The first is cross-national, which is to say between countries. Between elections, Kazakhstan's government pursues a more aggressive strategy towards political opposition than we saw in Georgia under President Edward Shevardnadze. The second point of variation is over time. Treatment of political opposition is actually quite different between elections versus during elections. And overall, this points to a need to consider both discrete events, such as elections, as well as long-term trends and strategies when examining the nature of these regimes. Thank you.
Thanks, Jody, and thanks, Danielle. A few questions here before we open up to the floor, one for each speaker. Danielle, I'm curious, you talked about political parties and the problems that face people about joining political parties. My question to you is why do people not even want to join a political party? And we've seen the recent example of Mr. Prokhorov, who's created a political party, but immediately announced that he wasn't going to be a member. We have the phenomenon of Vladimir Putin being the head of the United Russia Party, but not a member of the party. And you hear various other types of constellations of political movements that don't want to become political parties. So why is the fact of joining a political party deemed so difficult and so toxic in Russia? And for Jody, I think my question for you really is you've talked about the problems between elections and so forth, but I guess my question for you is are elections seen simply as winner take all? do they really kind of believe, that they're really only going to have one election, and once you've won that first election, there really aren't going to be any more elections? Is this just kind of an attitude that is throughout the region that is simply viewed as winner take all? So, Danielle.
Okay, so that's a great question, and I think there are a few different layers at which we can answer it. And the first one that I'll point out is that I'm sure many of you are familiar with the fact that in the 1990s we referred to a lot of Russian political parties as sofa parties. All members could fit on a sofa. So there's this the weakness of Russian political parties is in the post-Soviet era is quite robust. And I think there are a few explanations for this. One is, to a certain degree, a communist legacy, that in the Soviet Union, the only political party that was allowed to exist was the Communist Party, and it existed more as a form of state organization than as a member of the political competition. And I think that there was a certain distaste that in the 1990s came from sort of the ability to, the freedom to not join a political party if one wanted to advance in his or her career, perpetuated and reduced sort of an interest in joining something that had the word political party attached to it. I think that's part of it. I think and I think that might explain why individual citizens are reluctant to join political parties. But I think there are different incentives that explain why political elites, such as Putin, hasn't joined a party. I mean, Boris Yeltsin never joined a political party. And I argue that actually has in part contributed to why political parties were so poorly organized in Russia. And there are two reasons why why Yeltsin and why Putin have not joined political parties. The first is a very tactical reason, which is that if a leader doesn't join a political party, it's easier for him to dump the party when it loses faith among the population. And I wouldn't be the least bit surprised if this is what we see with United Russia going forward. So, when United Russia first came on the scene in the early 2000s, it was a convenient electoral bloc. It won a bunch of seats in the Duma, and it was unclear whether or not it was really going to become the hegemonic party that the Kremlin wanted it to. Previous attempts to form a pro-Kremlin party had been unsuccessful. Yet, at the same time, no one knew how long the arc would last. And as we saw in December, there was a lot of frustration and anger that was poured out against United Russia. And I think that Putin is hedging his bets. Is this a party that's worth keeping around, or do I want to dump it and create some other support mechanism for myself? So I think that explains some of their calculus. But I also think that there's another factor that's a little bit more idealistic, and this might relate to why elites and sort of Russians in general don't join parties, is they consider them to just be sort of ugly vote-gathering machines that don't really serve a meaningful in political institutions. And with this, there's a sort of idealism still attached to democracy. And it's worth thinking here about sort of the founding fathers of the United States, who believed themselves to be above political parties, who did not want to, you didn't see political parties developing in the United States until after Jefferson becomes president. And there was, this belief that true democracy is above parties. And I think there's a certain amount of idealism that still holds to some, among some Russians about that.
Jody.
I think, like any good academic, I'm going to answer your question with a yes and no, and it depends. And so your question is, are elections seen in the region as winner take all? And actually, I think that's, in many ways, the answer is clearly yes. I think that 75% of the answer is yes. But actually, we can break that question down in a lot of different ways. That gives us more room to answer it in a more complex way, I think. And so for the first question I would have to clarify your question, which you don't have to, but it depends on exactly who is doing the seeing, who we're talking about. Does the government does the government see this as winner take all versus the opposition versus average citizens? I think it also makes a difference whether we're talking about presidential versus parliamentary elections. Specifically, based on my fieldwork and interviews, it seems like presidential elections, certainly in most countries, are seen as winner take all, whereas parliamentary elections are not seen as much. And I think that there's also some overtime dynamics, which is to say that in practice, I think that if we went back 10 or 15 years and you asked this question, I don't know if everyone would admit that they're seen as winner take all, but certainly as history has shown, time progresses, that's what we've seen in practice.
Okay, we'll open the floor for questions here. In the back. Wait, we're going to get a microphone to you.
So I study Islam in Russia, and one of my questions, and this is for both scholars, what, if any, is the place of ethnic and religious minorities in the formation, creation, and duration of oppositional parties?
Danielle.
I'll go first, sure. I just want to write it down. So there's a short answer and a long answer. So the short answer is that there are laws on the books that prevent ethnic and religiously based parties from being formed in Russia, right? That's the short answer. The long answer is that the role of ethnic and religious minorities and their influence on political party development is very much tied into local patronage networks. So one specific example that I'll give you is Tatarstan. So that was one of the two regions where I did extensive fieldwork for my project. And what I found there, and I was in Tatarstan in 2008, so this was when Mintimur Shaimiev was still president of the republic. He had been in power since the mid-1980s. And I found that he was a very, very beloved member of the political establishment by both Tatars and Russians. So Russians living in Tatarstan also had on the whole, had a very high opinion of Shaimiev. And what Shaimiev had very effectively done throughout the 1990s was sort of build up his own local patronage network. And in the early 2000s, he effectively co-opted the local branch of United Russia and made it his own patronage network, to the point where the loyalty to United Russia in Tatarstan was not based on loyalty to Putin. It was based on loyalty to Shaimiev. Consequently, what ends up happening here is something really interesting. He builds this enormous regional level party machine. He gets all kinds of public sector employees and business people to join the party, and it becomes the largest regional branch of United Russia in the country. It wins and because of that, after the 2007 Duma elections, the largest regional bloc of deputies for United Russia come from Tatarstan. And who controls that bloc? Shaimiev controls that bloc. And it speaks to, I think, some very interesting dynamics about the interplay of these things. So just because there are laws in place that prevent religious minorities from forming parties doesn't mean that they haven't found their own other creative ways to become involved. And many people say, there's an argument to be made for the fact that the authoritarian turn that Russia started to take in the mid-1990s to late 1990s was, other regions caught on to the Shaimiev effect, right? Starting in 1996, presidential elections in Russia were highly falsified in Tatarstan. And, other regions started to realize, hey, you know what? Tatarstan's got the best bilateral relationship with Moscow. It gets tons of resources, and it turns out the vote for Moscow. Gee, why don't we start doing the same thing? So there's an argument to be made for the fact that this is actually an undercurrent to why you end up getting the authoritarianism that we see in Russia.
Jody.
I actually think this is a great question, and it's something that I've spent a lot of time thinking about in the past couple months. And so as I've been trying to conceptualize as well as operationalize what political opposition consists of across Central Asia and the Caucasus, I've actually done a lot of inductive work, which is to say I've read a lot of human rights reports and started to just think, who are the people or the groups that are criticizing these governments? And sort of the thorn in my side for a little while was the ethnic and religious minorities. And what I ultimately concluded was that really at the end of the day, in the countries that I study, they don't form political party. The ethnic and religious minorities are not as politically mobilized on that cleavage as some of the other groups, which isn't to say that there are no politicized ethnic groups or religious figures. But I think, at least from what I can tell, in many cases, the religious figures that are politically oriented and in some cases do suffer from some of these government practices, it's less to do with their religious bent, and it actually has to do with their oppositional activities and stance. So I think that to the extent that they are to be considered oppositional, it actually has to do with their affiliation to these secular political parties in most cases than actually a religion or ethnic group.
Right here.
Hi, my name is Repressive. I'm from Ukraine, and I very much agree with you on the point of the non-voting political participation that's lacking there. I think Ukrainian Orange Revolution is a great example of that. So I'd like to see if you would, kind of stretch a little bit some of your observations outside of Russia. I'm not offering Scotland to New Zealand, but perhaps let's include Ukraine. What do you think? Also, recently Harvard released a political study about social media participation in China. And what the study says is that the social media in China is actually not censored, but it's more of a steam valve where they prohibit sort of the centralization of uproar, but allow individual expressions. And I'm wondering if that's something you would observe in Russia as well. So those would be two questions. Thanks.
Great. Those are great questions. And, one of the goals that I have going forward with this project is to sort of test this hypothesis in other countries as well. And Ukraine is sort of my first country to look at. I haven't looked at the data enough to be able to give you a firm answer on this. The country that I can give you some pretty firm response on is outside of the post-communist world, but it's Indonesia. In fact, my book is actually a comparison about why democracy failed in Russia but succeeded in Indonesia. And in Indonesia, I find this is a country that's very poor. It's got a GDP per capita of about $4,000 a year compared to Russia's $115,000 a year. And it has an education literacy rate significantly lower. Only about 17% of the population of tertiary age is receiving higher education in the country, et cetera. And they have been very successful at building elite constraining political participation. And one of the reasons I find for this is that this is a country that has high levels of engagement in non-political civil society. And this is something that very much is lacking in Russia and lacking in the post-communist world in general. Now, this issue about social media in China as a steam valve, I really believe this plays out a major role in Russia, and I think has reduced the level of elite constraining political participation that we might have seen otherwise after the age of the internet. So to give you sort of an example, what I found is that there are a lot of individuals in Russia who, again, prior to this recent range of protests that we've observed over the past 6 months, who would rather than go out, stand on a cold street and hold up a placard, were very comfortable getting on a blog and just writing about how annoyed they are about the government. And so you saw a lot of blogosphere activity that didn't actually end up resulting in any political mobilization, but it served that purpose of helping people to feel better. Now, what I think has happened in the past 6 to 12 months is that Russians have actually started to use social media more for mobilizing purposes in ways that we have seen more historically in Ukraine. So again, I think that the excellent example was in the December 2011 State Duma elections. A lot of the fraud allegations came to light because people were capturing images on their mobile phone cameras when they were going to vote, and they were posting them on YouTube. And suddenly, allegations that previously had traveled via word of mouth and people, didn't know whether or not they believed them, they had some teeth behind them, and people started to get angry about that. Similarly, we see more cases of when police brutality has been documented, or issues of resisting arrest have been documented, again, on your phone, mobile cameras, and then up on YouTube. And people are starting to realize, hey, there's a side to this story that's not being covered. But I think that this is a relatively new phenomenon, that we're seeing sort of more mobilization happening in that. But I do think that actually the ability of people to speak relatively freely on the Russian internet for a long time made them sort of comfortable to let off steam without actually going and mobilizing politically.
In the back.
Belonging to Pakistan, I was kind of stuck by both of the speakers because the points that you guys raised about failure of democracy in Russia and in the surrounding region, I could see it playing out in Pakistan too. And I was curious. You talked about compliancy between. The people were very complacent and they don't really come out on street as much. And I'm just curious to know, when Russia was was transitioning into democracy, were people more Russians more excited then and were more wanting to get involved in the system and in building the political institutions. And when they saw like it's kind of not working out and they have become more complacent, is the reason of their complacency, like the failure of the political institutions being set up in Russia? And second question is that you talked about patronage system, and I see that in Pakistan and India and like South Asia region, like and like political actors have relations with individuals, and that's how they resolve matters. And do you think it's because of Eastern political culture versus Western political culture? So yeah, thank you.
So regarding the first question, did Russians become complacent when they became dissatisfied with democracy? I think that's a very common explanation. And I think it's a problematic one to try to answer clearly for a couple of reasons. There are other confounding factors that influence political participation. In the early 1990s, Russia experienced a major economic catastrophe that indeed contributed to people's dissatisfaction with the political regime, unquestionably. But also made it harder for them to mobilize politically at that period of time because people were not receiving their salaries. And if you're not receiving your salaries, you spend your weekend going and growing potatoes on the plot of land that you have, 150 miles outside of the city, rather than joining a political party. So it's really hard to disentangle that specific period of time. However, my experience and my research has shown that if Russians became complacent because they were dissatisfied with the system, then they're very impatient. And to me, that's inconsistent with what I know about Russians. Okay, and this is what I mean by that. Complacency sets in when you have spent a lot of energy trying to accomplish something and you don't see any results. In my experience, based on my research, I found that Russians in general, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, didn't spend a lot of time trying to change anything. So it's hard for them to, it's hard to argue that. I'd be more willing to accept a complacency argument from someone who spent, every weekend trying to get a local candidate elected to the legislature and was unable to do that, from somebody who said, well, this one guy I was kind of interested in, and, the party paid me $25 to go and collect signatures, and I did it, and he didn't get elected, and, oh, well, I don't really care. That to me, that's not, and what I know of Russians is that they're extraordinarily patient people. So I think that there are other factors that are explaining their demobilization. In terms of the question about Eastern versus Western political culture and patronage networks, I think that I'd be less inclined to find an answer to that question in political culture as into institutional incentives that guide behavior. Any sort of system that's going to find any sort of system in which a person is going to find that his or her problem is better resolved by seeking help through a patronage network is going to develop that sort of a network. If they find impersonal institutions to be ineffective, they're going to avoid them. And that happens in the East and in the West.
Joe, do you want to comment on patronage or East versus West? Or? No? Okay.
Thank you. I was hoping that if one broadens out the definition of political opposition to groups that are questioning of authority, perhaps not in a directly political sense, I sometimes think that we pay too much attention to political parties and not enough to NGOs and more specifically religious communities, not just minority religious communities, but specifically majority religious communities, which I think the governments are post-Soviet and other governments are very well aware of the potential political mobilization power and ability of these groups. And that's why they have set in place throughout the former Soviet Union definitions of religion, of types of religion, or organizational structures of religions, that some of which are officially acceptable and some of which are not. And therefore, the leaders of groups that happen to be not found officially acceptable can serve as rallying points, and often do serve as rallying points for opposition on a wide range of issues, and pay, in some cases, a considerable political price for that, including court cases and fines and closures of houses of worship. So I was hoping that you could respond to that, not to mention, of course, political organizations which have religious linkage, some of which have not advocated for violence, but nevertheless have been found extremist and attacked or prosecuted for that reason.
Sure. I think that I share your hesitation to limit political opposition to just political parties. And so in considering all groups that regularly criticize the government or issue, public statements or activities against government policies, that's specifically my attempt to include some of these NGOs as well as media outlets that I think should be included as part of political opposition, especially in this region where I think, as we all know, and Danielle has showed us this afternoon, political parties are not necessarily a strong form of political organization. And so some of these more diffuse movements, and especially media outlets, can be just as important to consider as political parties. And I think in practice, in many of these countries, the individuals that are engaged in political activism are not necessarily limiting themselves to just political parties. Opposition activists are not likely to say, "Oh, I'm sorry, I'm a party guy. You'll have to go talk to someone else about media." In practice, they kind of have their hands in all of these different pots, if only because the community is so small and there's so few people in many cases that are actually engaged in these activities, that those few people are engaged in many activities. I do draw a line between political versus religious activism, and I am interested in religious groups to the extent that they are politicized, and they certainly would fall within the purview of this study. But I think that you've raised one of those points that would be fascinating to study, but is certainly a separate project, which is to say that I think that across Central Asia and the Caucasus, as well as the entire post-Soviet region, there are a lot of interesting things going on at the intersection of religion and politics. But to look at them from a primarily, religious, taking the angle of religious groups, I think would generate a different set of conclusions and findings. So that's maybe a different project.
Come back here. Yeah. Okay.
Well, thanks. Just one more quick question. We're talking about Russian politics here, and no one mentioned the word Putin yet, so maybe we can bring it up quickly. And I was wondering, if the sort of transformation that we've seen over his past, 2, 3, 4 terms, depending how you count it, in his political repressions and things like this, whatever you want to call it. I would like to ask you, basically, would you be able to parallel his transformations that we see with the way that political transformation in the Russian minds goes on this, again, non-elite constraining things? Just, if you could help me tie those two together. Thanks.
So if you look exclusively at Putin's policies in his first elected term of office, so from 2000 to 2004, you can make a very strong argument that the policies he engaged in at that time were state-building policies. He inherited an extremely weak, diffuse state. For those of us who are old enough to remember Russia of the 1990s, in the mid-1990s, there was a really open question about whether or not the Russian Federation would continue to exist in its current format. And what Putin did during that first term of office was engage in a variety of reforms that some could construe as being anti-democratic, but all did serve the goal of trying to centralize and strengthen the Russian state. You can't have, just a very basic sort of democratization theory argument. We can argue that there are no prerequisites for democracy except one: you need to have sort of a stable political borders. Okay, and that was something that Russia really didn't have until the 2000s. Putin's second term of office is where we start to really see this period of de-democratization. But the roots of that were earlier, right? The first and very clear example of this was in 2000 with the closure of the NTV television station. And that, something that's very interesting about that particular instance, it was very much viewed by the West as a clear example of de-democratization, using a very obscure rule about minority shareholders for Gazprom to basically gain control of the board of directors of NTV and throw out the editorial board. Now, in Russia at the time, and the public opinion surveys of the time account for this, most Russians saw this as a rule of law thing. They didn't see it as a de-democratization thing. They saw this as Putin upholding the rule of law. And a lot of the de-democratization that took place in Putin's first 2 terms of office were construed as being adherence to the rule of law. Now, another factor that relates to this that I think gets at your question, and I address in my research, is the enormous amount of political trust that was placed in Putin during his first 2 terms of office. Now, his trust has declined substantially in the past 4 years. Levada publishes monthly polls on his trust levels, and I don't remember the most recent one. It was under 50%. It's important to bear this in mind. In most democracies, the presidents very rarely have approval ratings of above 45%. Okay, so for Putin to have an approval rating of like 38 to 40%, he's doing pretty well in terms of cross-national standards. This is nothing for him to be embarrassed about. But this man had approval ratings in the 70% for most of the early 2000s. People had an enormous amount of trust, placed an enormous amount of trust in him. And so if Putin said, we need to cancel gubernatorial elections as an anti-terrorism strategy, people kind of bought that. And I think what we've observed now in the past year has been a loss in that trust. And I think that the origins of this, they predate actually the September announcement that he was going to run for a 3rd term. And they go back to when Putin sort of anointed Medvedev as his successor in 2007. In 2008, when I was conducting this research, I found that a lot of very smart Russians who liked Putin were very much insulted by this decision. That, and they would say, well, I support my country. I want to go and vote in these elections, but who can I vote for, right? We've got Zyuganov, who's run in every election since 1991. We've got Zhirinovsky, who's, a complete idiot. And then we've got this funny-looking guy with curls who we've never seen before, right? The only person that I feel comfortable giving my vote to is Medvedev. But why do you insult me by not allowing any genuine competition into this? And that level of insult that educated, sort of patriotic Russians felt 4 years ago continued to simmer over the past 4 years. And when Putin sort of announced that he was going to come back into office, I think that was sort of the straw that broke the camel's back on that.
Down in front here.
Good afternoon. I have 2 questions to both speakers. One and one. So the first hypothetical question regarding the Khodorkovsky's case. It's clear that Boris Nemtsov is not a unifying leader for the opposition movement. Can you foresee, hypothetically, in case Mikhail Khodorkovsky is ever released from the prison, he'll be actively engaged in the opposition movement, and he will become indeed a unifying figure for many Russians, pro-Western thinking? The other question is in regards to Georgia and its repressive strategy, as you've identified, to be intermittent. I did some research study for one of my classes on Eduard Shevardnadze's decision-making and his leadership style, especially in the early 90s. He was known in the late Soviet period as a pro-democracy, pro-democratic leader. So do you attribute that intermittent repressive strategy regarding his political opponents to his leadership style that was leaning more towards democracy as opposed to other Georgian politicians? Thank you.
So I don't foresee that Khodorkovsky will be released from prison unless Putin's regime is completely overturned, by which I mean not just Putin leaves power, but the entire infrastructure that supports him is completely changed over. So I think the hypothetical of Khodorkovsky being released from prison is one that is unlikely to take place. If he were released from prison, I don't foresee him becoming a unifying figure for the opposition for a variety of reasons. There are many Russians who think he legitimately belongs behind bars. But secondly, I think in his own best interests, I think the man is going to stay away from politics. I mean, I don't want to sound crass, but I don't see him. I mean, I don't see him taking on this sort of major political role. I have a hard time picturing who would be a unifying figure for the Russian opposition right now. I think it's really interesting, all of the recent discussions about Prokhorov. I mean, if anyone's followed his political career at all closely, first, a year and a half ago, he agreed to be the head of the Kremlin-sanctioned, right cause, pro-democracy party, and then, was basically fired after a day from that, and then the only reason why he was even sanctioned to run in the March presidential elections was because nobody would take him seriously, right? I mean, he sent for those, most of you probably are aware of this, but Prokhorov has an older sister who's a very well-renowned literary critic in Moscow. And he sent her in his place to participate in the presidential debates. Okay, I mean, this is not, I think that right now the opposition, the street level opposition's being quiet about, no one's coming out and saying anything anti-Prokhorov very strongly because they think, oh, maybe he might be the one person that could potentially finance an opposition. But I don't think that he's a realistic opposition figure either.
As for Shevardnadze's leadership style and his own personal preferences, I think that to attribute this repressive strategy to the fact that Shevardnadze simply liked democracy more than Aliyev or Nazarbayev is oversimplified. And certainly Shevardnadze has a reputation in the West for being this great democratic liberalizer, and as well as he had a lot of rhetoric in his anti-corruption campaigns. But more than anything else, I think that what Shevardnadze was known for was being incredibly strategic, and somebody who was very good at getting done what he saw fit. And so I would say that I think that it's actually the other way around, that some of his image as a great Democrat is because that served his larger goals rather than the other way around.
Thank you both for the very thoughtful and insightful presentations. My question is for Jody, and this follows up on the Georgia aspect. I'm very interested first as to why you solely focused on Shevardnadze and not Saakashvili, and what comparisons, contrasts do you see between their leadership style? And I noticed that you didn't have Georgia as one of the democratic countries. He does have a very pro-democratic image, at least in the Western world. Where do you see the future of Georgia? Thank you.
So yes, so I look at Georgia under Shevardnadze as part of the revisions of the book manuscript, developing it into a book from a dissertation. I plan to add the Saakashvili era into the analysis. I think that, well, I can't answer with exactly where Georgia is headed. I think that we can say that under Saakashvili, there has been more room for political opposition, and yet at the same time, I'm not convinced that the overall strategy, in fact, is all that different. Certainly under Saakashvili, we've seen a lot of state building and a lot of attempts to centralize authority and whatnot. But at the end of the day, if you look at some of the events of 2007, 2008, there have been attacks on political opposition that, whether or not they're exactly intermittent or not, I think that overall there are certain constraints on political opposition that I suspect may not be as different as before.
A lot of hands right here. The middle, and then we'll go back.
Hi, I just had a quick question about kind of a more theoretical point that you had in your presentation. I was wondering how you to me it seems that the non-voting participation and openness are kind of both dependent variables, because to me it seems that openness influences participation and vice versa, especially in the realm of civil society. For example, there was a lot of evidence that after the color revolutions, Russia at a very high level was aware of the role civil society organizations played, and therefore they cracked down on them or they kind of co-opted them. And so I was just kind of wondering how you kind of see those as an independent versus dependent variable scenario. Thanks.
I love theoretical questions. So the way to think about this is as a matter of sequencing. So first you have this period of political openness that in my case, I start looking at it at the late perestroika period. And at that point in time, Russia has one level of political openness. And then non-voting political participation comes into the mix, and then determines then the level of political openness that you see at a later period. So that's sort of the sequencing of it. But your question gets at another point that I didn't go into in the presentation, which is sort of how do I conceptualize political participation? And I see that as actually being quite different from engagement in civil society. So political participation I define as citizen actions that try to influence the composition or policies of national or local governments, which is different from engagement in civil society, which has to do with participation in voluntary organizations, which may or may not be political. And in fact, when I look at something I didn't talk about today, is sort of what then influences these patterns in non-voting political participation, and whether or not you get more elite constraining or elite enabling forms of participation. And I find there are three factors that contribute to that. One is level of engagement in civil society, another is level of political efficacy, and the third is political trust. In terms of engagement in civil society, which again is separate from political participation, I use completely different measures to look at them both. Russia cross-nationally has very low levels of engagement in civil society. I'm not the first person to document that. It's very well known. And that, in my opinion, contributes to why you see Russians contacting public officials more often than you see them going out and protesting in the streets. Because they're less engaged, because they spend more of their time sitting around their kitchen tables complaining about the government, drinking tea, rather than complaining about the government at a bird watching club, they're less likely to get recruited into other more organized collective forms of action. Now, your point about the way that the Russian government's attitudes changed is absolutely correct. So you see this and that's documented by the level of political openness. So after the Orange Revolution, you see a crackdown on the amount of on the existence of civil society organizations. But the truth of the matter is, and this is something that's so interesting, level of engagement in civil society in Russia increased between 1995 and 2003. So even after crackdowns on organizations, the actual level of participation increased, although it's still quite low. I mean, and I personally, this is just an opportunity to share an anecdote about this. You know, I was conducting research in Krasnoyarsk, and I actually, just as an academic, little graduate student out, interviewing people. And I actually caught an FSB tail and had the people who were helping me, I was a visiting scholar at a university, brought in and interrogated because they believed that I was there to foment an Orange Revolution and that I was handing out money to NGOs. I mean, that just speaks to the level of paranoia that the Russian government had at that particular period of time.
We're going to get some new people ask questions. In the far back, and we'll work your way back to the front.
So as someone who's more familiar with Ukraine and Russia and the political repression that has happened there, can Jody speak to some of the repression that she has seen in Kazakhstan, for example, especially with the violent tactics that they, you say, employ? Thank you.
Well, I won't ruin your afternoon by telling you story after story. I've ruined other people's afternoons with that. Well, I think that I think that one of the best ways to illustrate some of these different tactics is to look at approaches to the media and how some of the opposition media outlets have been dealt with. And as I said, in Georgia, the main tactic as described by lots of people, is the government engages in public and private criticism, which is to say sometimes these editors are brought into government offices and told, like, we really don't want you to talk about this. We're really angry that you exposed this or something like that. Don't do that again. Or the president or some other high-level official would go on TV and talk about exactly why, the opposition wasn't doing what they should do. In Kazakhstan, though, things are they just are a little bit more violent. The editor of one of the independent newspapers, Respublika, in 2002, for example, she found a decapitated body of a dog on her office window with a note saying that this was her last warning. And this newspaper had been, targeted and intimidated for years, and this continued long after this particular event. So they being unspecified actors, decapitated a dog, left the body at the office. She found the head and a similar note saying that this was her last warning and they really needed to shut down activities near her home. And 3 days later, the newspaper's office was destroyed by Molotov cocktails. So that's actually in quite stark contrast to, a private meeting or even public criticism on TV. These are, even when the violence isn't targeted specifically to the individuals, and there have been some cases of that as well, these are very, kind of graphic, bloody methods of intimidation that go on there.
Right here? Right down here. Right there. There you go.
Thank you very much for these really interesting talks. My question is actually for Jody, and I was wondering if you could speak to whether you feel that regional factors are important to explaining the differences between your cases, so the Caucasus versus Central Asia, and just from kind of very informal personal anecdotes that I felt like in Kazakhstan people tend to compare their regime with other Central Asian regimes, and I was just wondering if that kind of allows people to be more accepting of the tactics used by Nazarbayev's regime.
Yeah, I think that when you talk about regional differences, there's a lot that could be wrapped up there. Certainly, the Caucasus are closer to Europe. I mean, there's just a very geographical distribution here where certain countries are closer to Europe, thus they tend to be on the West's radar a little bit more, or they're, more likely to be included in NATO, something like that. There's also some issues of citizens' perceptions, culture, and whatnot. I think at the end of the day, we could talk about the larger post-Soviet world and cross-national and other cases, but what it really gets down to is a question of who shapes these attitudes and who shapes some of these perceptions. So in the case that you brought up of, Kazakh citizens comparing themselves to Central Asia and at least we're not Turkmenistan or whatnot, a lot of this I think can be traced back to some of the strategies of the government. I mean, I think it's part and parcel of that. Who are we comparing ourselves to? And even during, during the period when the color revolutions were going on, there were several broadcasts on state media showing what was going on in Kyrgyzstan, but it certainly was with a bent towards showing how disorderly and terrible this was. And aren't we very lucky that things are stable here? And so forth. So I think that really these are all part and parcel of these larger strategies that part of it is shaping public opinion.
Question down here? Still have a question? You still have a question? Okay.
Okay, coming back to the religious questions, I know there is a positive correlation between being an Eastern Orthodox and living in a poor and often autocratic or semi-autocratic state. So I was wondering about if you have noticed any destabilizing effect on political participation in Russia because people, are parishioners of the Eastern Orthodox Russian Church. Thank you.
I'm really glad you asked that question. So I could talk for a really long time on this topic, so I'll try to keep my comments brief. So first of all, just addressing this correlation has to do with the fact that the majority of adherents of Eastern Orthodoxy reside in former communist countries, and former communist and country, by definition, if it is former communist, it underwent a period of state-enforced secularization, and that has had profound effects on the levels of religiosity and relationship that citizens have to the church in these regions. So one thing I have observed a relationship between this, but perhaps in ways that are a little bit different than what people might expect. So only 11% of Russians belong to religious organizations. On average, cross-nationally, the global average is about 40%. Okay, so Russians belong to religious organizations at a significantly lower rate than most other residents in the world. In spite of the fact that you see a revivalism in religion in Russia over the past 15 years, fewer than 5% of Russians attend religious services on a weekly basis. That's one of the lowest averages in the world. What does this mean for political participation? There's very strong, robust cross-national evidence that shows that attendance at religious services is an involvement in religious life is a very strong avenue for recruitment into politics. And this happens via two channels. First is the acquisition and diffusion of what we call civic skills. So the ability to write a letter, organize a meeting, deliver a public presentation. When people have been empowered with these skills, usually via or participation in religious service, it's easier for them to apply those skills to a political context. So this isn't happening in Russia. That's the first thing. The second thing is that religious institutions, religious organizations, more than any other type of voluntary organization in the world, crosses socioeconomic boundaries in a way that it serves as the most common form of non-commercial activity that you're likely to see. And the fact that Russia is not engaging in this, I think, has had a very strong impact on the lack of mobilization. And again, this gives me sort of the opportunity to talk about my counter case of Indonesia. So Indonesians on average, more than 80% of Indonesians belong to a religious organization, and more than 60% of them attend religious services on a weekly basis. This gives them a lot of opportunities, especially these people who don't have a secondary degree, who maybe haven't even graduated from high school. It gives them a chance to learn how to give a public presentation, how to organize. They organize, and we're talking here about Islam, we're not talking about Eastern Orthodoxy. Women's prayer group. They gather a group together, they figure out how to get tea for the group, they organize a guest speaker. Suddenly they have the skills to organize a campaign event. Okay, so this is something that's not happening in Russia, and I think that a large reason why it's not happening there is this legacy of forced secularization that Russians experienced in the Soviet period. To the extent that Russians are religious and have developed religious beliefs or Orthodox beliefs, they're very private. By which I mean Russians are more inclined to go to a church on their own time, light a candle in front of an icon, pray in that manner, rather than attend a Sunday service. There are really good reasons why they don't do that. You have to stand, okay, for a really long time, and there's intense incense, and this can be, it's a physical act to sit through an Orthodox service. So I understand why people don't go, but the problem is when they don't get together, they're not meeting each other. They're not a congregation. They're not having the opportunity for interaction.
Oops, more questions. Eric.
Thank you both for your presentations. My question is for Danielle. Given the fact that a lot of the push for democratization came from the top down, and a lot of the current opposition leaders like Kasyanov, Nemtsov in Russia, even Saakashvili and Zhivanya originally, came from the ruling party. To what extent does the nature and composition of the elite matter? And given your cross-national study, do you think it's possible that an elite can constrain itself?
That's a great question. Can an elite constrain itself? I'm skeptical that an elite can constrain itself. But I'm basing that more on logic than anything else, right? Every individual, even the president of the most liberal country in the world, has an incentive to reduce the number of veto players who are going to try to block his policy. So any political elite is going to have in his or her interests the goal of maximizing power. And I don't think anything about my other cases can help to show that. Now, this question about sort of the elite in Russia is a really good one. And as I mentioned before, I have a hard time picturing who could be sort of new elites coming into the political picture. But in this, I see sort of a bigger problem that's not about the elite, the class of political elites in Russia, and it has more to do with the relationships between the state and society. So Russians have very low political trust cross-nationally. So if we compare cross-nationally, Russians trust their political institutions and their democratic institutions less so than countries of comparable history, etc. But what Russians really trust are individuals. So they'll place a lot of trust it used to be in Putin, or it might be in a governor, it might be in a very specific member of the Duma. but they won't trust political parties. They won't trust the Duma as a concept. And herein lies the problem. For democracy to work, people have to trust the processes. People have to be more trustworthy that the outcome of an election is going to determine who has access to power, rather than trusting that a particular individual, if he or she comes to power, is going to make decisions that are in the benefit of society as a whole. And I think until that belief can become more widespread, we're just going to continue to trade elites who are going to seek short-term ends rather than sort of long-term goals. I mean, the one difference here is I think for Yeltsin, for all of his faults, he didn't maximize power under the Constitution the way that he could have. There was a certain amount of pro-democracy sentiment that he possessed. And, I mean, he engaged in a lot of anti-democratic behaviors as well, but waiting for the right person to occupy the White House, I don't think is going to be a good strategy for Russia's democracy.
Go ahead. Last question.
This is for Danielle. You brought up a really interesting point when you discussed Russian religion, and one of the things that seems, from my understanding, is that given the Russian government's attempt to almost make sure that orthodoxy remains the only game in town, if you will, it's very harsh stance toward outside proselytism, other religious organizations coming from abroad. And yet at the same time, it seems very self-defeatist in terms of building trust within the Orthodox environment, if you will, as a whole. You can look recently at the sort of outburst over the Patriarch's watch, which was a particularly interesting tidbit where I believe his watch was very, very expensive foreign watch was removed in some digital pictures. I think as an institution, it seems to not be a very effective mechanism for getting Russians involved. I mean, I think that sort of supports your previous assessment, but I was wondering again what you see the future of orthodoxy, particularly, again, many Russians having a specific distrust of the orthodoxy that continue to persist under the Soviet system is seen as a very corrupt institution in and of itself. So just looking for your impressions on that.
So you raise a really great question, because the comment that I made before really had to do more with grassroots involvement in religious organizations as opposed to the structure of those institutions as a whole. And the Orthodox Church, it occupies a very interesting position within Russia. It's become significantly more empowered in the past 20 years. In terms of officially non-political organizations, it has more financial and property wealth at its disposal than most other non-political organizations. But it has that because of its cozy relationship with the Kremlin. You're not going to see the Orthodox Church turn into a force for opposition. And you're also not going to see, the other thing that's so interesting and bizarre about the church is given all of these issues of distrust that you mentioned in your question, it occupies one of the highest positions of trust among institutions. So Russians have this trust problem in general, but they trust the Orthodox Church more than they trust almost any political institution. That gives the Orthodox hierarchy quite a bit of power, but I don't really anticipate that it's going to use that power in a political way as far as mass mobilization is concerned. It might in terms of other things. I mean, we're seeing all kinds of really interesting ways that the church has influenced public policy in terms of having Orthodox religious values being taught in schools. You're seeing an anti-abortion movement happening in the country that had the highest abortion rates in the world under the Soviet era. So it certainly has a role to play in politics, but I see it being more disconnected from citizen behaviors than other organizations might be.
Kathy has one last point to make.
I totally agree with what you're saying, but I think it's important to specify that we're only talking about the Moscow Patriarchate, because if you're talking about other Orthodox churches in Russia, they're losing property, etc. They're having a very tough time of it. Absolutely.
And with that, I think that there is important variation across the regions in terms of the level of tolerance for non-Orthodox religions. So, another, I think, a really interesting example is Kazan. So Kazan and the capital of Tatarstan, recently built what they argue is the largest mosque in Russia. The Orthodox Church there has been dealing with issues of property, but generally speaking has a relatively good channel of communication with the powers that be. The Catholic Church was given a prominent piece of land in downtown Kazan to build a cathedral, and the synagogue is open. Okay, this speaks volumes to a level of religious tolerance in what's considered to be sort of one of the primary Islamic regions within Russia. And I also saw sort of more accommodationist strategies towards minority religions in Krasnoyarsk as well. So we do see variation, I think, across Russian regions. But your point about the patriarchy is well taken.
Well, thank you very much. At this point, I want to bring the conversation and discussion to a close, but I'd like to thank our speakers for their very interesting presentations. Thank you for your questions, and we look forward to seeing you at future Kennan Institute events. Thanks so much.